As you've heard, I'm the chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Smart Cities. Dan Biles, our previous moderator, in fact, was my predecessor, as some of you will know. And just looking around the room, actually, I see a number of the faces who are participants in that. For those of you who don't know, that's really trying to bring together business. We have 20 more councils now, and obviously parliamentarians, so that at the national policy level, we can be thinking about how smart cities can work for everybody. Now, we've heard this morning so far really about how different technologies and different opportunities can work, principally, of course, in the last session, looking at transport. But I think that what we want to now try and look at more carefully is how do we turn that into a more holistic, a more strategic approach, if you like. Is it about having a clear vision? Is it about a more collaborative form of leadership? Is it actually about the capabilities of the technology? Or is it possibly not about systems, but about mindsets? Now, I've got an excellent panel here who are going to tackle some of these issues, and it's an interactive session, so we're looking for your questions in a moment. We've had our time tightened a little bit, so I'm going to try and keep things on the move. But let me just introduce the panel if I can. Immediately on my right, I have Sean Weir, who is the director of Arqiva. Then next to him is Steve Turner from Manchester, head of Future Cities. I think that's the right title. Good. Dylan Roberts then next to him, who's the Chief Information Officer at Leeds. And then on my far right is Stephen Hilton, who is the director of the Future Groups at Bristol. So we've got three major cities from England here, together with a major industry leader to tackle this question. Gentlemen, let me kick off, if I can, by looking at this issue with each of you individually. Let me perhaps, if I start with the cities, so I'll start at the far end, if I can. Stephen, in terms of Bristol, what would you say in your experience is the most important element of trying to knit this together, to try to get a genuinely strategic approach in your city?
Thank you, Mark. So very briefly, I would suggest that there are three things that I now believe are sort of core to the approach in Bristol. I think after a decade of pilot projects, I recognise that smart cities is actually about building our innovation capabilities. So how we as a city council partner with universities, with businesses, in order to be able to recognise that this smart city journey is going to go on for the rest of my life, I'm afraid. It's probably going to go on for the rest of your kids' lives as well, and therefore building that innovation ecosystem is absolutely key. At the same time, it's also about scaling up. So it is about putting in the infrastructure, the partnerships, the companies, the ventures that can help us to deliver at a bigger scale. And I think thirdly, the thing that's occupying me at the moment is around this idea of devolution. So Advesi talked about data devolution being something that is part of our conversation with government, about how do we devolve information from government to cities. And I guess the second part of that contract is how do we then devolve that information from cities to citizens? And how do we create an approach that we're thinking of as a commons approach, a data commons, that allows for new benefit models where both businesses, cities and citizens can all benefit.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's that issue about how you get the collective benefit is a real challenge. Dylan, perhaps looking at Leeds, if I can, what's your take on it in the city there? It's a different geography and, in the sense to Bristol, but nevertheless common problems?
Yeah, I resonate a lot with what Stephen says there. I think the big thing for us in Leeds is to take a user-driven approach and to make sure that our use cases for what we're about to do are the right ones, because fundamentally digital smart cities is a means to an end as opposed to the end itself. So we apply an approach, using a buzzword, we apply an approach known as design thinking, which has been used in cities such as Amsterdam and Chicago, whereby we pull people together. So if we think about Leeds is going to be one of the best places to grow old in. So to deal with that issue of the ageing population, for instance, our approach in the first instance is to pull together older people with professionals from across the system, voluntary sector, public and private, and bring with them a connection into some digital entrepreneurs, big and small, with a view of, in the first instance, being very clear at defining what the problem is and being clear about that problem. And what we found through some of those pilots, and again, we need to think about scaling up, The pilots whereby we followed that type of approach, where we've got a really solid use case, have been proven to be sustainable, because fundamentally they do what the user needs and wants. I think the other second aspect, which I think is very important, is the whole selling point of the smart city is the value of the whole, as opposed to the individual constituent parts. So I think a push on, similar to Stephen really, from our perspective, smart cities is going to be going on for a long time. Therefore, we've got a very strong push on design principles. So for me, my role is not to design the smart city as the CIO for the city, but fundamentally is to help to facilitate and provide leadership around getting other people on their projects to embed smart cities thinking and design principles, so that if highways are doing something, it can interrelate and interact and interoperate with other projects from other places. So they're the two facets of our approach, which we hope will hold us in good stead.
So, I mean, one of the interesting debates in this area is, do you make one person responsible, or do you make sure that everyone sees it as their responsibility, albeit within a strong leadership structure? You, by the sound of it, have gone for the latter.
Yes, most definitely. From my perspective, I see the technology. I see the people on this panel more as leaders and facilitators. And fundamentally, I see, so if you use the council as an example, in terms of, highways and transportation, for instance, I would expect the chief for highways and transportation to be thinking smart, to be knowledgeable about what smart cities are about, to be knowledgeable about digital, and be applying that to what they do. Planners, it's part of what everyone should be doing. It's not the job primarily of the technologists.
Okay. No, well, that's one of the debates I think we've seen in cities like Boston in the US, where actually they've tried to make sure that everyone sees this as their role, rather than it being put in yet another silo, which can often be the challenge in large organisations. Crossing the Pennines, if I can, to Manchester, and a different scenario in the sense that I think the excellent leadership that we've seen in terms of the combined authority there, driven in part, and I'm a big fan of what Howard and his team have done, driven in part because the city council boundary are quite small, there's been a necessity at the start of that conversation to work with your immediate neighbours. We're hearing about collaboration, as it were, within Leeds. From Manchester's point of view, what about the Greater Manchester approach to this? What's your take on how you get a genuine strategic approach to delivering this?
I think, Mark, you stole the word I was going to use there, which is collaboration, really. And I think that's certainly the thing for me that it's been at the heart of the GM evolution. And I think around smart cities, certainly, I agree with what Stephen said about pilot projects. The problem with pilot projects I see is they're quite often delivered by the public sector. The previous Mayor of Barcelona said, I don't want any more pilot projects in my city, please. I think, the very nature of smart cities has to be around collaboration. We all bring very different skills, very different capabilities to the table. As Dylan was saying, I think as a city authority, we're there as an enabler, a facilitator, but we need the big industrial players. We need our strong SME communities, and we also need our universities as well to be in there, and of course our citizens. So it's definitely about collaboration. That's at the heart of sort of building a strong foundation for me, and I think that's what we're starting to see as a DNA piece in Greater Manchester, running through everything we try and do, and it certainly applies to this as well.
And is it your view as well in Manchester, what Dylan was just talking about in Leeds, about starting with the public and making sure they're engaged on specific projects, is that similarly something which you've seen? Clearly it's not an easy process.
I don't think we're as good as we should be at it. I'll be brutally honest. I think we could do an awful lot better. We've just started doing some work with the Future Cities Catapult, I think Gemma's over there somewhere, around that user-centred design. I think that, that is definitely for us the model that we would like to permeate across GM. I think it has been a little top-down, if I'm brutally honest.
It's a natural thing where change comes forward. There are always going to be those who proselytise it and others who are trying to catch up, and that's the nature when technology changes. And let me come to Sean. Sean, Arqiva is very involved in a number of different cities, so you're perhaps able to look at this in the round. We've just been hearing from Steve about this issue about pilots. In fact, I think all three have talked about pilots. Are we getting a bit pilot crazy? Do we need to scale up here?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, and I think probably one of one of the key issues facing businesses as they try to engage with cities is the the scope and scale and the pace at which we're engaging on particular projects and so on. I mean, Arqiva, just so perhaps people need to quickly get a sense of who we are. We're a communications infrastructure and media business, and right now we're building the Internet of Things network for low power communications in the UK. It's live in about 59 towns and 10 cities, including the 3 cities that we've got here. And as a result of doing that, we found ourselves engaged with a very large number of businesses looking to get involved in the Internet of Things and exploit Internet of Things for their own business purposes. We're also involved, of course, at the city level. So we're in a number of the Innovate UK, 2 of the successful Innovate UK bids. We're working with one of our partners, ADI, on a health IoT demonstrator. And what I'd say, though, generally speaking, is that it's quite hard work getting these projects up and running. To give you an example, we've got one pilot project. It's taken us 9 to 12 months to define and agree the scope of the project, and the pilot will run for 2 years. So broadly speaking, 3 years from now, we will have some information about what the outcomes of that pilot are. Now, for a business in that context, it's really quite hard for us because we're now looking 2 or 3 years out and saying, where's the commercial certainty for us around the investments we're making in these programs and these pilots, and is there really a bit of business at the end of it, or is life going to change? So I think there's a number of challenges that we face in terms of businesses engaging with cities around this. I just characterize that as I think there's probably 2 or 3 things that I would highlight that we come across that I think the cities need to sort of consider. One of which is their scope and scale of their executive leadership. I think these cities here are probably better than most on that, but having a strong CIO who can drive the agenda, who can build political consensus across the different councillors around the programs that they're wanting to undertake is really important. I think having clarity around where the funding is going to come from is really important if you're talking a strategic approach. A lot of the cities today rely on grant funding to get their projects up and running. That tends to be fairly short term, and it tends to have its own set of characteristics. In other words, the projects are designed to satisfy the grant funding requirements as opposed to the city requirements sometimes. There needs to be a sense of business momentum in the cities, and that's about really having a sense of knowing what's happening and getting driving the pace and driving change within the city and within residents. I mean, there's a fascinating statistic that we got from some research we did this year around the awareness of smart cities amongst the population, and 96% of people we talked to couldn't name any smart city initiative at all. So, the awareness needs to be built up around that if we're going to build these programs and get them.
And do you think that's partly terminology? I mean, I'm slightly leery about smart cities as a phrase simply because it's all it's all meaning. It means whatever it does to the person expressing it in a sense, and you might say that's possibly a natural habit for a politician. But I wonder whether we need to drill down. I mean, many people will say, "Oh yes, I've got a brilliant bus app." Or I've got this, but they wouldn't necessarily think that was smart cities. Do we need to think about the terminology?
I think a lot of people actually do understand the terminology. I mean, if we look at some of the very smart applications that people, generally speaking, are using, not in the smart city context, but actually businesses just out there doing it. I mean, the Uber app is a classic example of an app that people are prepared to use and adapt. And I think people are ready to accept smart city infrastructure. Again, a lot of people would, if they knew they could park in the city, they would go into the city and shop. And there's evidence that supports that. They just, don't know about this and so on. So, I think the terminology isn't so much of a problem. I think communicating that to the people of the city is a challenge.
And that's the difficulty. Okay. No, well, that's very helpful. Thank you for that. Let me just come back, if I can, perhaps principally really to the 3 cities on this one. We talked about the positive sides, but let me just, because I think the danger with panels like this is sometimes we always talk about the nice things. Can I just perhaps put you slightly on the spot and I'll start with Steve from Manchester at this end, if I can. Looking at some of the projects you've done, you don't have to say which one, but If there's a thing, I really mustn't do this next time, or there's a top tip that other authorities here ought to be thinking about, is there one thing where you think, avoid X? I'll just kick you off with that one.
I mean, I think we said earlier, didn't we, Mark, about, I think this is really important to sort of tease out what is not working, what has gone wrong, because that's where you get your learning from, really. And the word I'm going to use is procurement here, which will resonate with everybody, public and private sector. We're constrained by procurement rules.
ODU or just?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But that presents us with big challenges, and I think there's a specific challenge in this area. It applies to other areas as well, because I think a lot of the technology, the knowledge, capabilities, understanding of the technologies lies within the private sector. It doesn't lie within the cities, and yet we are quite often having to undertake the procurement, and we have to start to do that in a much more intelligent way. We have made huge disasters in Manchester. My chief executive will speak later, so I'm not going to dirty washing in public or anything like that. But you know, we do need to move to a much more intelligent way of procuring the right sort of services. It's very interesting, some of the work, and we can look overseas here in terms of the work that Copenhagen have done recently, in terms of the procuring their data platform. Very intelligent way of doing it, going out to providers, having a conversation, defining the outcome, defining what you want, and not getting word from a city authority what it is, what you'll actually put in place. It's the outcomes that we should be able to define. So procurement for me is the big one that needs to be
well, and certainly as an ex-minister, I think the words computer and Whitehall don't necessarily gel too well historically. Dylan, in Leeds, what would your take on that? I mean, I heard, and I suspect people, when we come to questions, may want to come back on procurement, but in your experience, now we've got the washing partly out and we've heard the other side of the Pennines, what would you say was your sort of top tip not to do from Leeds' point of view?
Well, funnily enough, mine was going to be. I think it's everyone's, but I think a top tip for me, funnily, it links into what you were saying earlier on, and that is stop talking about smart cities, actually, because, I mean, in terms of our politicians or the public or whatever, actually, Leeds is going to be the best place to grow old. Leeds is also going to be the best place, etc. And this is how we're going to do it. It's expected.
So focus on outcomes that people can relate to. Okay, well, that's a good point.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Good. And Stephen, Bristol.
So I'd definitely echo some of what Steve said. In experience, I think time often trumps money. Some of the most difficult projects have been very well funded, but have had ridiculously short timescales that we haven't been able to control, and that's not allowed for proper engagement, and therefore the projects have not really taken hold. I guess what I would add, which I think is comes back to this point about scaling up, is sometimes we've delivered really successful projects. They've delivered all of their outcomes, they've been on budget, they've been on time, and we get to the end of the pilot or the project and it stops. And then it feels often like there is then a gap, sometimes of years, before the system is ready to absorb the learning and the outcomes from those projects. And I think what we're getting better at is actually building in thinking about scaling up as part of the project itself, so that we start to think about, well, what are the long-term financial implications for the council of this pilot? How do we change our business model in order to be able to accept and utilise the learning from our pilots? What do we need from our partners? What are the different sorts of infrastructure models that we need to put in place in order to grow things at the end of the pilot? So seeing pilots as the first step, we're all pioneers. What we need is the settlers within our organisations to follow us, and I think that's what we're trying to get better.
I'd just like to come in on that. I think what's important there, I'd agree with that, it's really important when you're progressing with these projects, right from the pilot or concept stage, that you're including the people who are going to actually end up involving in it. So, you know, if it's a health project, it's really important not just to include the council, but, you know, the CCGs, etc., some of the providers, independent providers, or whatever. Everyone needs to be included right from the beginning, because actually you're handing it over then to business as usual, and they're the people fundamentally who are going to have to make those business changes, process changes, sometimes a paradigm shift in terms of the way they're operating money, etc.
But this is about driving place-based benefits, isn't it? And how we move away from what perhaps has been more organisational benefits accrued as opposed to place-based ones. And to get to that point, I don't know you guys, but it's where public and private sector invest jointly, where risks are shared but rewards, of course, are also shared as well. And I think, as I agree with Steve, I think the pilot projects don't enable you necessarily to be able to do that because they're not purely commercial.
And I would echo that about shared risk and jointly investing, and businesses are ready to get on and co-invest and go with the cities on the programs they want. But I think we have to be clear where it's taking us, right? So I think the strategic direction needs to be very clearly laid out. And if we're going to do a pilot project, let's do a pilot project, but the intent of the pilot is then to do the following afterwards. And that's laid out, and then we can build a business case around the bigger plan, not just the pilot itself. If the pilot is just a self-serving small project that exists for its own reasons, it'll wither and die on the vane, and none of us will support it going forwards. But if you said, well, this is the prize at the end, and we build a business plan around that, you'll get companies queuing up to co-invest around those programs with you and share that commercial risk and share that technology risk and the best practice that we have from going from the lab into mass deployment, which we do all the time in industry. We're always innovating and then taking it out. It's at scale. That skill and expertise exists.
Good. Yes. Last one, I will just take quickly, and then I'm going to come to the audience because I want to make sure people have a chance.
On that, I mean, I guess an ask of government, and I think Manchester have already asked, to be honest,
Too much.
is what we need is place-based budgets.
Yep.
These projects are
Yes.
about delivering outcomes, not services. Yeah, I mean, the public sector is less and less. So if we have truly place-based budgets and those sort of approaches, you can build those business cases far easier and deliver a better bottom line.
Yep. Lastly, Stephen, then I'll move on.
Picking up Sean's point, everyone's on the same page here, I think. But I think give credit where credit's due, the funding bodies, Innovate UK around the Internet of Things piece around it in the minute, and the European Commission are getting this now. I think they're getting it. They're moving away from they really are making sure that you're building scalability, you're building replicability, and you have your private sector partners there at the start. So I think the funding are starting to get that, actually.
And I think one of the interesting things with the devolution debate in terms of political governance is realising that handing out grants that are tied to central government priorities actually won't get us to placemaking. It's actually about saying, these are your resources, these are your challenges, you work out how to use the money in a way, and that then hopefully will deliver a more holistic approach, as you say, to placemaking. Right, so lots of food for thought there in terms of whether it's about having the vision, who leads that, whether we can break down the bureaucratic silos within any organisation and indeed between public and private, how and what experiences people have about making a pilot not an end in itself, but actually the beginning of a process. Lots of thoughts there, and very happy to start taking some questions. So if you could give I was going to say your name, rank and serial number, but your name and organisation and then your question, that would be great. There's a gentleman on the front table here. Microphone's just coming to you, and I thought I saw a hand over this side as well. And there's a lady over here who would be second. Okay, yes, sir.
Simon Mitchell from Accenture. Just supporting Dylan's view, I think that the concept of pilot that proves something, then a pause until a grand project emerges, is perhaps thinking a little bit, of yesterday's method of doing things. From a more agile and iterative method, you build the project, you scale quick if it succeeds, or you kill it if it doesn't. But the concept of it being a contained stage, and then you start to think about what you do next, I think is perhaps a little more challenged in such a dynamic environment. Just an observation.
Okay, well, perhaps I can turn it back. And in your experience at the moment, is most procurement that you're engaged in tending to be of what you've just described, rather than having a clear end outcome of which the pilot is part of the process? Is that your experience?
What we're finding, certainly from a central government perspective, is that there's a fundamental change in the way that, for example, IT projects are now procured. They're now collaborative ventures between the public-private sector. Risk is shared. The projects evolve, emerge, and indeed, if they're not successful, they stop and they iterate and they change. So I don't think that we're now necessarily buying the grand thing that takes a year or two to specify and then going to market to buy it. We're starting very small. We're iterating regularly. And we're evolving those. And that's, with some of the great ministries of state, DWP, HMRC, they're moving to that delivery model, and it's proving a lot more successful.
Yeah, I hope that certainly we in Parliament and the National Audit Office will then start to be a little less old-fashioned, frankly, in terms of how we judge these things and actually look at the other end outcome. But just quickly, Sean, if I may, thank you for that. Is that your experience? Is that what we've just heard from the gentleman there from Accenture? Is that right?
So on some of the businesses we're working with, the pilot will be 3 months. You know, we will do a pilot project for 3 months. We'll quickly understand the results of that, and then we will be taking those results into, okay, what does this mean for the next phase? And you're scaling up, right? You're not saying, oh, let's do a pilot for 3 months across this, and then we're going to do the entire company. Okay, well, the next phase might be, you know, a bit more than that, and you build up, and it's that iterative, very quick learning approach where you find the results, you validate your business case, you validate your assumptions, and you quickly move on from there. And it's really contained.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Right, the lady here, and then I think there's another hand over the far corner over there, the gentleman with the glasses. She's got a microphone, that's great.
Lucy Heathfield from Keir. My question, Steve, you touched on universities. Obviously, smart cities being the future I believe is our children. How you speak about the private sector and local government coming together, but how much really should we be involving our universities and really tapping into that as a method of...
Good, and that's for Steve from Manchester, is it?
Well,
for the panel as a whole?
Out of the whole panel,
okay,
Steve
sure.
was the only person who actually touched on
universities
university.
We'll kick you off with that.
Well, I mean, the answer is obviously yes. Of course we should be doing. I mean, you know, the huge assets that we have. In Manchester, we've got 2 of the largest in the UK. But what's interesting is they are located right next to each other in the Oxford Road, and we're using the Oxford Road to demonstrate and to pilot quite a few initiatives. So it's certainly engaging the university is critical, not just from an academic perspective, but as they're starting to move their funding model, moving on to the startups, the spin-outs that are generated from it, that's where you start to see growth, all the sorts of things we like to see. And I think there's a couple of our SMEs who've perhaps partly spun out of our universities. So yeah, absolutely need to be engaging with them.
And in Bristol, I'll come to you in a moment, Dylan. In Bristol, Stephen, is that your view?
Yeah, I think I mentioned briefly when I spoke at the start that in Bristol we have really put some structure into the way that we work with the university now. So we've created a joint company called Bristol is Open as a venture between Bristol City Council and the University of Bristol. And its primary purpose is to enable us to deliver city-scale experimentation. So looking at how we can anchor the expertise of the university, which has, you know, truly global academic expertise, but how we can anchor that from the city and how the city council can bring to that the social, the environmental, the economic challenges that we are trying to address within the city. So I think our relationships with the universities are actually becoming quite formal in terms of how we collaborate around this.
Dylan, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to say exactly right. I think it's really important to work with all of the academic institutes, and I think the key thing, the enrolment conversation with the universities, I'm liking the fact that universities now have to demonstrate impact of research. So, you know, if cities are test beds to demonstrate that impact, then that's great. So I think it's very important to use the universities. Although, again, culturally, trying to get universities to think it's not just about the academic aspect, it's also about the impact on the ground, and speed is also something.
And does it help the fact that I think in certainly all of your local enterprise partnerships, the universities are an integral member of that, so they're sitting with the business and the civic leaders, so that dialogue has been happening in that way. Good, okay. Now there was a hand up in the far corner here, and then there's a gentleman here. I think we should have the microphone, and then there'll be one further on the, the front table there. Sir, at the back.
Yes, morning. David Bishop, Nottingham City. In answer to the question, how do we develop a strategic approach to smart city development, don't we need to rescue the phrase smart city from technology projects, with all due respect? Are we not talking here about holistic, strategic visions for cities that are based on collaboration, as your colleague said? It's about being smart in so many more ways, and I think there's a danger we go down a rabbit hole of projects and procurement. Of course these are crucial, of course they're part of it happening, but you've got to have smart decision making at the highest level, doesn't make mistakes but does things that are joined up, you know, so we don't encourage more cars into the city centre, causing more congestion. You have electric buses, you get rid of the particulates. you have cycling, you have the infrastructure that's necessary for businesses to be smart, for people to move around. Those are just some examples of
Sure.
a broad, holistic approach to smart cities led by visionary leaders. Isn't that what we need to do when we're talking about smart cities?
Thank you,
Rather than
David.
getting stuck
Absolutely,
on projects?
absolutely right. I'm going to ask for very short answers because I see there's other hands wanting to come up with. I'll just start with Sean. Is that right? I mean, really, there needs to be a plan, a vision, as it were, before you can actually apply the technology.
Well, I completely agree. I think one of my first points was we need strong leadership within the city. We need a clear vision of what the city is doing, and then the projects that the city wants to engage us on fit into that, and we understand how the whole thing works and how it's delivering the value that the city is looking for. So the business can understand what it's putting at risk and how it's going to benefit, as well as how the city's going to benefit and how the citizens are going to benefit. And it all needs to be clear.
Thank you. And I think, Stephen, you was going to take a view from Bristol's point of view.
Hello, David. As you will know, Bristol's vision has always been to be a city where livability is our key driver. And we often talk about smart as one of the enablers. So it's the road that we're travelling down, but in itself, it's not the destination. I have no desire to create smart as the goal. I think the goal is around creating sustainable prosperity. It's about creating a livable city. It's about creating a low-carbon city that offers a high quality of life to everybody. And we're really explicit in all of the leadership and the vision that we have for a city that's smart is an enabler of that.
Exactly. Good, thank you. Let me move on. Gentleman here, and then I saw the gentleman there who has his microphone already. Yes, and I'll come to you.
All right, thank you very much. I'm Brandon Owens. I work for Publicis Worldwide, agency of record for my friends at City here. And, you know, throughout the talk, I think we touched on funding, and, you know, where is it coming from? And I think it was a great point about grant funding and how, you know, it's driving the priorities of the grant, not necessarily the priorities of the business or of the city. So my question is, what is the role of financial institutions in partnering and thinking through and being visionaries, and how can those relationships evolve as we move forward to help enable these types of projects and smarter cities moving forward?
Great. And I'm going to come to Sean about that in a moment, but I'll take the second question from the table here, if I may, and then I'll take the question here. And I'm going to ask the panel then to wrap up on those because I'm aware of time and I want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to come back. Sir.
Tex Edwards from KLR. We're investors in infrastructure. Kiwi accent. I'm here for the conference, not the rugby. Could the panel share its position on benchmarking smart cities and the operating statistics that should be benchmarked on both a national basis and an international basis? League tables and benchmarking are fraught with political problems and politics, but I'd be interested to hear the panel's perspective on how benchmarks can be used to drive the smart cities theme
Okay,
forward.
lovely. And then I will take the question at the front here. If we can grab the microphone back to the front table here. That's lovely.
Thank you, Heather Cheeseborough, Hounslow. I've got one question. I just want to pick up on the comment the guy from Nottingham said. He said we shouldn't make mistakes. I think here we are talking about smart and innovation. Of course we're going to make mistakes. There's nothing wrong with making mistakes. We should learn from them. But actually the key issue is about being open to risk. And I think local government has traditionally been scared of taking risks. If we're going to be out there doing cutting-edge stuff, we'll make mistakes, but we just have to be happy that we do it and learn. So that was the point there. The question I had was, I'm feeling really inspired by everything, you know, the guys are sitting up here today. What I'd like to know is how are you communicating this out so I can learn and pick up? I mean, do I have to go and talk to you individually, or do you disseminate the information and communicate what you're doing so that we can learn?
Good, right. So we've got a really interesting question about how that we engage with the financial institutions. I'll start with Sean and work across from my right to left in a moment. Then we've got a question on benchmarking. And we're not going to talk about rugby, quite rightly, I think, at this moment as an Englishman, but we wish them all well. And finally, this issue about how do we communicate. We've got three cities here who are already in the sort of vanguard of what's happening. The question is, how does that then get disseminated? How do we make best practice common practice? Sean, do you want to kick off on a couple of those?
Yeah, happy to talk about the funding.
And we only have 2 minutes between you, I'm told. So
2 minutes between us, right? So
short
I've
and
got my
snappy.
30 seconds. Well, I'm not a bank, so I can't talk from a banker's perspective on that. But as a business perspective, we're going to invest and put our capital at risk against programs. Then what we need to understand is, what are the metrics of the program? How is it measured? What is the certainty around that program? And is the business case sound and secure? And do we all buy into that business case? And making sure that decisions to move around that business case are clear and understood, and they're not, necessarily, we don't make whim decisions and so on.
Okay.
But we're okay to take risk. Okay, that's part and parcel of it.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Steve, Manchester.
Really briefly, on the finance piece, I think Howard Bernstein will be picking up on some of that later on, so I'll let him talk that. But needs to say, we're actually kicking off a project over the next 2 years under URBACT, which is about how do we, I'm answering the question already on, how do we move away from this pilot approach to commercial models? And financial institutions will be part of that programme over the next 2 years with 9 of the European cities. Benchmarking, only if the lessons are in there and we get things haven't worked. I'm not actually a big fan of league tables. I'm not, although a rival newspaper had us quite high up on last Friday, but it's nice to be in there, but Hounslow, yeah, very happy to talk. Core cities have a network, and the new Smart Cities Network has just been set up, which is led by Glasgow. But I think one of the key roles of that network is to disseminate. And of course, there's people here for the Future Cities Catapult who should be expanding, disseminating as well.
Good. Thank you. Dylan.
Yeah, quickly then, in terms of finance, I think in terms of the approach on co-production, we're keen to get companies in to be part of that. If you're clear about the use case, hopefully you're clear about the business case. So that's that one. I think angel investors, accelerators, etc., important for all cities to be linked into to those. In terms of the benchmarking point, I don't think we should be benchmarking smart cities at all. Right? I think if we're taking a whole system approach, well, the whole system in Leeds, even different parts of Leeds, is different from the whole system in parts of Manchester or Bristol, for sake of argument. So actually, we should be benchmarking on how we deliver whole system outcomes, not smart cities. Personal view on that. In terms of the networking, I was going to mention the Core Cities group. There are other groupings, local CIO council or groups like that, which these sort of messages and approaches are disseminated out.
Good, lovely. And last but by no means least, Bristol. Stephen.
So some quick thoughts. In terms of finance, the fact that the Chancellor's talking about cities retaining their business rate growth is interesting, and it's a mechanism that we've used for our enterprise zone. We do need Bristol's created 3 companies. We have an energy company, a waste company, and a research company with a variety of public and private sector partners. So we need to think. Our chief exec Nicola talks about profit with purpose. So how can we not be ashamed of generating revenues, but be really clear that there are ways that we need to reinvest that in order to tackle city challenges. In terms of benchmarking, I'm much more interested in benchmarking around quality of life, inclusion, employment, livability. Those sorts of things are good measures. And in terms of comms, well, I kick the team out. I always say to the team, if you're in the office for more than half the week, you're not doing your job properly. And it's not about, for me, about one-way comms. If you want to find out what Bristol's doing, there's stuff on bristolisopen.com, Twitter, all over the place. But actually, the purpose of comms is to get the team to come to places like this so that they can talk to other people about what they're doing, and that's where the innovation often comes from. It's from the conversations in the networks.
Well, that's a very good point on which to draw the conclusion to this particular discussion. We've covered a very wide waterfront. I'm sure there are things you'll want to raise with the members of the panel individually, but for the moment, would you join with me in saying a big thank you to all of them? Thank you.